It started with laughter, but not the kind that brings people together. No, this was the sharp, cutting kind that slices through dignity like a blade. The kind that echoes in studios and leaves scars on souls. Whoopi Goldberg sat back in her chair, still chuckling at her own joke, her co-hosts joining in with nervous giggles that felt more like ammunition than amusement. The audience was clapping, some laughing along, completely unaware that they were about to witness something that would change the very air they breathed. And there, sitting perfectly still under the blazing studio lights, was Morgan Freeman. His hands folded calmly in his lap, his eyes closed for just a moment longer than normal, as if he was gathering something from deep within his soul. The cross pendant around his neck caught the light briefly, and when he opened his eyes, the entire studio seemed to shift on its axis. The laughter died instantly. Not gradually, not politely, but like someone had cut the power to sound itself. Whoopi's smile froze mid-expression, her eyes widening as she realized that something had fundamentally changed in the room. Her co-hosts stopped mid-giggle, their faces suddenly serious, worried. The audience, just seconds before filled with mirth, now sat in complete, suffocating silence. Morgan Freeman hadn't moved. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't even opened his mouth yet. But somehow, with nothing more than the weight of his presence, he had transformed a mockery into a moment of reckoning. You could feel the tension breathing in the room, alive and electric, as cameras captured every second of what was about to become the most powerful exchange in daytime television history. The veteran actor, the man whose voice had narrated the stories of God himself, was about to speak. And deep down, everyone in that studio knew that whatever came next would either shatter hearts or heal them. There would be no middle ground. What happened in the next few minutes didn't just go viral. It rewrote the rules of how faith, wisdom, and respect intersect in the modern world. And it all began with one man who understood that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to let sacred things be treated as jokes. But before we reveal the words that silenced an entire studio and moved millions to tears, you need to understand how we got to this moment. Because what led up to this confrontation will shock you even more than what Morgan Freeman said. If you're ready to witness wisdom triumph over mockery, hit that like button, drop a comment with the word respect, and make sure you're subscribed because this story gets more incredible with every past 3 weeks before this moment that would break the internet. A seemingly innocent email landed in Morgan Freeman's management office. The subject line read, "The View Invitation Faith in America Discussion." But those who knew the entertainment industry could smell the setup from miles away. This wasn't about discussion. This was about spectacle. "They're hunting," whispered Morgan's longtime publicist, sliding the printed email across the mahogany desk. "Look at the wording. Challenging traditional beliefs in modern society. Examining outdated religious practices. This isn't a conversation, Morgan. This is an ambush." The room fell quiet as Morgan read through the invitation, his weathered fingers tracing each carefully chosen word that seemed designed to provoke rather than explore. His team was unanimous. "Don't do it," urged his agent, pacing behind the leather chairs. "You know what happens on that show. They invite people on to make them look foolish. They'll twist your words, take things out of context, and edit you to look like some old-fashioned preacher." But Morgan Freeman had spent decades in Hollywood, had seen the rise and fall of trends, the ebb and flow of what society deemed acceptable to mock. What they didn't understand was that Morgan had been carrying something heavy in his heart for months. He'd been watching the culture shift, seeing faith treated as a punchline, watching young people lose hope because the things that once provided comfort were now sources of shame. He'd received thousands of letters from fans who felt abandoned, dismissed, laughed at for believing in something greater than themselves. "Sometimes," Morgan said quietly, his voice carrying that unmistakable gravitas that had commanded respect for decades, "the most dangerous place for truth is also the place where it's needed most." His team exchanged worried glances. They knew that tone. It was the same voice he used when he played God, when he narrated documentaries about human resilience, when he spoke about things that mattered beyond entertainment. Social media was already buzzing with anticipation. Liberal voices questioned why The View was platforming someone they saw as too traditional, too spiritual. "Freeman's been in Hollywood too long," One blue-checked account tweeted, "Hope they're ready to fact-check his fairy tales." Conservative circles, meanwhile, sensed a trap. "They're setting him up to look foolish," warned popular commentators. "This is going to be painful to watch." But what none of them knew was that Morgan Freeman wasn't walking into that studio as an actor, or even as a celebrity. He was walking in as a man who had survived poverty, racism, loss, and decades of an industry that tried to define him. He was walking in carrying the voices of everyone who had ever been mocked for believing in something beautiful. The night before the taping, Morgan sat in his study, reading a letter from a teenage girl in Ohio who wrote, "Mr. Freeman, they laugh at me at school when I pray before lunch. Sometimes I wonder if God even cares about kids like me." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket, right next to his heart. What Morgan Freeman carried into that studio the next morning wasn't just his own faith, it was the faith of millions who had no voice, no platform, no way to defend what kept them alive. And when Whoopi Goldberg decided to turn their beliefs into a punchline, she had no idea she was about to face something far more powerful than fame or wit. She was about to meet wisdom itself. Stay with us because what happens next will restore your faith in the power of truth, and you'll want to share this moment with everyone you know. The studio felt different that morning. Even the crew members sensed it as Morgan Freeman walked onto the set with that quiet dignity that had made him one of the most respected voices in entertainment. He wore a simple navy blazer, a crisp white shirt, and around his neck, barely visible, a small silver cross that his grandmother had given him 60 years ago. The audience applauded politely, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity, almost anticipation, as if everyone could feel that something significant was about to unfold. Whoopi greeted him with her trademark smile, the one that had charmed audiences for decades but carried just a hint of mischief today. "Morgan Freeman, everybody," she announced, her voice bright and welcoming. "The man who literally played God on screen. I guess that makes you qualified to talk about faith, right?" The audience chuckled, and Morgan smiled graciously, settling into his chair with the calm presence of someone who had nothing to prove. The conversation started innocuously enough. They discussed his latest projects, his legendary career, the roles that had defined him. But anyone watching closely could see Whoopi circling, like a skilled predator waiting for the right moment to pounce. Her questions grew subtly more pointed, more loaded with implication. "So Morgan," she said, leaning forward with that conspiratorial tone she'd perfected over years of television, "you've played some pretty, shall we say, spiritual roles. God, wise mentors, the voice of wisdom itself. But tell me, in 2025, with everything we know about science, about human psychology, about the universe, don't you think it's time we evolved past these old comfort blankets?" The studio went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of anticipation, but the sharp-edged silence of a room holding its breath. Morgan's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He looked at Whoopi for a long moment, then glanced at the audience, as if he could see straight through the cameras into the living rooms of America. "Whoopi," he said, his voice carrying that unmistakable warmth that had narrated countless stories, "I've learned something in my 8 decades on this earth. The moment we start calling hope a comfort blanket is the moment we forget what it means to be human." His words landed softly, but they hit with the force of absolute truth. A ripple went through the audience. Some shifted uncomfortably, others leaned forward. Whoopi's smile flickered, just for a second, but she recovered quickly. "But surely you don't still believe in all that literal stuff? The miracles, the divine intervention? Come on, Morgan, you're too intelligent for that." And that's when something beautiful happened. Morgan Freeman didn't get defensive. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he smiled with the patience of someone who had seen the world try to shake his foundation many times before and had watched it fail every single time. "Intelligence," he said slowly, "isn't about dismissing what you can't explain. It's about having the wisdom to recognize that some mysteries are worth preserving." He paused, letting the words settle. "I've stood in cathedrals built by hands that believed in something greater. I've watched people find strength in prayer when medicine failed them. I've seen faith turn broken people into healers. Tell me, Whoopi, what's more intelligent, believing in that power, or pretending it doesn't exist because it makes us uncomfortable?" The audience was completely still now. A few people in the front rows were nodding slowly. Someone whispered, "He's right." And in that moment, you could feel the entire dynamic of the show begin to shift, like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of the earth. Whoopi tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out hollow, forced. Whoa. Looks like we've got ourselves a philosopher today. But her co-hosts weren't laughing. They were watching Morgan Freeman with something that looked suspiciously like respect. If you've ever felt mocked for believing in something greater than yourself, if you've ever been called naive for having faith, then you need to see what Morgan Freeman says next. His response doesn't just defend belief, it transforms the entire conversation in a way that will leave you speechless. Hit that like button if wisdom resonates with you, comment faith if you believe some things are worth defending, and make sure you're subscribed because Morgan Freeman is just getting started, and what comes next will shake you to your core. The temperature in the studio had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Whoopi's playful demeanor was hardening into something more calculated, more aggressive. She wasn't just hosting anymore, she was hunting. Her fingers drummed against her note cards as she prepared for what she clearly saw as the killing blow in this ideological battle. "Okay, Morgan," she said, her voice taking on that edge that regular viewers knew meant someone was about to get taken down. "Let's get real here. You talk about faith like it's some beautiful thing, but let's talk about what religion has actually done to this world. The wars, the oppression, the hatred. How do you reconcile your pretty little cross with the Crusades? With slavery justified by Scripture? With people using God as an excuse to hate?" The audience tensed. This wasn't a question, it was an accusation wrapped in intellectual packaging. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the conversation had crossed a line from discussion into something more personal, more vicious. Morgan Freeman sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, that silver cross catching the studio lights. For a moment that felt like an eternity, he said nothing. But his silence wasn't empty, it was full, pregnant with the weight of lived experience and hard-earned wisdom. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had wrestled with these very questions in the dark hours of his own soul. "Whoopi," he said, and there was something almost gentle in his tone, like a grandfather speaking to a child who had just discovered that the world could be cruel. "You're confusing religion with faith. Religion is what people do with buildings and power and politics. Faith is what happens when a mother prays over her sick child at 3 in the morning, when no cameras are rolling and no one is watching." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I grew up in Mississippi in the 1940s, in a world where the color of my skin meant I was considered less than human. And you know what kept me and my community alive? It wasn't the religion of the people who oppressed us. It was the faith of the people who sang spirituals in the cotton fields, who found hope in the darkness, who believed that somewhere beyond all that hatred was a God who saw their worth when the world refused to." The studio was dead silent now. You could hear the soft hum of the cameras, the barely audible whisper of the air conditioning, but no human sound. Several audience members had tears in their eyes. Even the cameramen had stopped adjusting their equipment, caught up in the raw honesty of the moment. Morgan continued, his voice growing stronger, more passionate, but never losing that underlying gentleness. "You want to blame faith for the evil that men do? Then you might as well blame love for every broken heart, blame hope for every disappointment. Evil doesn't come from believing in something greater, it comes from believing that you are something greater." Whoopi's mouth opened, then closed. For perhaps the first time in her television career, she was genuinely speechless. Her co-hosts were staring at Morgan with something approaching awe. One of them, Joy Behar, was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. But Morgan wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn, creased photograph. The image was faded with age, showing a small wooden church with peeling paint and a congregation of African-American faces, their Sunday best threadbare but dignified. "This is my church from when I was 7 years old," he said, holding the photo so the cameras could see it. "These people had nothing. Nothing but each other and their faith. And you know what they built with that faith? They built me. They built a community that raised children to believe they were worthy of dreams, even when the world said they weren't. They built hope in a place where hope should have died. His voice cracked slightly, just for a moment, and in that crack, you could hear 60 years of gratitude, of love, of unshakable conviction. So when you mock faith, Whoopi, you're not just mocking an abstract concept. You're mocking the thing that saved my life, that saved my community, that continues to save lives every single day in ways your cameras will never capture. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was sacred. And in that moment, everyone in the studio understood that they weren't just watching television anymore. They were witnessing something profound, something that would change hearts and minds long after the cameras stopped rolling. What happens next will absolutely floor you, because Morgan Freeman isn't done yet. When Whoopi tries one final, desperate attack to regain control, Morgan's response doesn't just defend faith, it reveals a truth so powerful that it stops the entire show cold. You won't believe how this conversation transforms from mockery to reverence in just one sentence. Stay tuned, hit that like button if this is touching your heart, and comment, truth, if you believe some battles are worth fighting with grace instead of anger. The silence stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Whoopi sat frozen, staring at the faded photograph in Morgan's weathered hands, her carefully constructed composure crumbling before millions of viewers. But pride is a powerful thing, and sometimes it makes people double down when they should surrender. Her jaw tightened, her eyes hardened, and she made a choice that would haunt her long after the cameras stopped rolling. "That's all very touching, Morgan," she said, her voice dripping with condescension as she set down the photograph without really looking at it. "But let's not romanticize the past. Those people you're talking about, they were kept in line by fairy tales. They were told to accept their suffering because some invisible man in the sky had a plan. Don't you see? Religion was the opium that kept them docile, kept them from fighting back. You're celebrating your own oppression." The words hit the studio like a physical blow. Gasps echoed from the audience. Someone in the third row actually stood up, shaking their head in disbelief. A cameraman pulled back from his viewfinder, his face pale with shock. Even Whoopi's co-hosts looked stricken, as if they couldn't believe she had just crossed that line. But Morgan Freeman didn't explode. He didn't shout or storm off the stage. Instead, something far more powerful happened. He grew still, not the stillness of defeat, but the stillness of someone who had just been given the perfect opportunity to reveal a truth that the world desperately needed to hear. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but it carried the weight of every injustice he had ever witnessed, every triumph he had ever celebrated, every tear he had ever shed. "Whoopi," he said, and there was something almost heartbreaking in his tone, "you just called my grandmother's faith fairy tales. You just called the hope that got my people through slavery, through Jim Crow, through poverty and pain, you just called that opium." He stood up slowly, his full height imposing not through aggression but through sheer moral authority. The studio lights seemed to dim around him, as if even the electricity recognized that something sacred was happening. "Let me tell you what those fairy tales built," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "They built the Underground Railroad. They built the Civil Rights Movement. They built the strength for Rosa Parks to stay in her seat, for Martin Luther King to dream his dream, for countless unnamed heroes to choose love over hate when hate would have been easier." The audience was transfixed. Several people were openly weeping now. A young black woman in the front row mouthed the words, "Thank you," through her tears. Morgan took a step closer to Whoopi, not threateningly, but with the presence of someone who would not be silenced. "You want to know what faith really is? It's not accepting suffering, it's believing that suffering isn't the end of the story. It's not being docile, it's having the courage to forgive your enemies while still fighting for justice. It's not opium, it's the strongest force in the universe, because it's the only thing that can turn hatred into healing." And then came the moment that would be replayed millions of times across every platform on the internet. Morgan Freeman looked directly into the main camera, his eyes seeming to peer through the lens and into the soul of every person watching. To everyone out there who has ever been told that their faith makes them weak, that their hope makes them naive, that their belief in something greater makes them foolish, don't you believe it for 1 second. The same faith that sustained slaves is the same faith that toppled empires. The same hope that comforted the oppressed is the same hope that changed the world. And if that's not power, I don't know what is. The studio erupted, not in applause, but in something far more profound. People began standing not because they were told to, but because their hearts compelled them to. It started with one person, then two, then entire rows, until the whole audience was on their feet in reverent silence. Whoopi sat alone in her chair, small and diminished, finally understanding that she hadn't just attacked an abstract concept. She had attacked the very foundation of hope itself, and in doing so, had revealed the poverty of her own spirit. But what Morgan Freeman says next doesn't just defend faith, it transforms mockery into a moment of grace so beautiful that it will restore your belief in the power of forgiveness. His final words to Whoopi don't destroy her, they offer her redemption, and what she does with that offer will shock you to your core. Keep watching, hit that like button if this is moving your soul, and comment, "Grace," if you believe in the power of second chances, because this story is about to show you what true strength really looks like. The standing ovation continued, but it wasn't triumphant, it was reverent, like the silence after a prayer. Morgan Freeman remained standing, but he wasn't basking in the moment. Instead, his eyes had found Whoopi, who sat hunched in her chair, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the photograph of his childhood church that still lay on the table between them. The weight of what she had said seemed to be crushing down on her shoulders like a physical force. And then, in a moment that would define both of their legacies forever, Morgan Freeman did something that no one expected. He sat back down, leaned forward, and gently picked up the photograph. But instead of putting it away, he slid it across the table toward Whoopi. "I want you to have this," he said softly, his voice cutting through the applause like a whisper that somehow reached every corner of the studio. The audience fell silent again, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. Whoopi looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed and confused. "Morgan, I can't take this. After what I said." But Morgan Freeman was already shaking his head, that gentle smile returning to his weathered face. "Whoopi, do you know what my grandmother taught me in that little church? She taught me that grace isn't something you earn. It's something you give, especially to people who think they don't deserve it." The cameras captured every detail, Whoopi's hand hovering over the photograph, afraid to touch it, Morgan's patient expression, the audience holding its collective breath, even the crew members who had stopped pretending to work and were openly watching this moment of profound humanity unfold. "You called my faith fairy tales," Morgan continued, his voice never losing its warmth. "But you know what the greatest fairy tale is? The idea that we can judge someone's worth by their worst moment. The idea that mistakes define us more than our capacity to grow." He gestured gently toward the photograph. "That little church taught me that every person is worth saving, especially when they're lost." Whoopi's hand finally touched the photograph, her fingers tracing the faces of people she had just dismissed as deluded. When she looked up at Morgan, there were tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why are you being kind to me? I attacked everything you believe in." Morgan Freeman leaned back in his chair, and for a moment he looked less like a movie star and more like what he had always been at heart, a teacher, a guide, a voice of wisdom in a chaotic world. "Because that's what faith actually does," he said simply. "It doesn't make you better than other people. It makes you responsible for loving them anyway." The silence that followed was different from all the others that had filled the studio that day. This wasn't the silence of shock or tension or awe. This was the silence of transformation, of hearts being changed in real time, of viewers around the world witnessing something they had forgotten was possible in their divided age. Whoopi wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her voice barely audible. "I grew up in the church too, you know. I used to believe, but then life happened, and I got angry and I—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "And you put up walls to protect yourself," Morgan finished gently. "We all do. But walls that keep pain out also keep love out. Faith isn't about having all the answers, Whoopi. It's about being brave enough to keep asking the questions, even when the world makes you feel foolish for caring." He stood up one final time, but this time he extended his hand to her. "The invitation to hope is always open," he said. "It doesn't matter how far you've wandered or how long you've been gone. The door is always unlocked." Whoopi looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, then slowly reached out and took it. As he helped her to her feet, the audience began to applaud again, but this time it was different. This wasn't applause for a victory or a defeat. This was applause for redemption, for the possibility that even the deepest wounds could heal, that even the hardest hearts could soften. And as the two of them stood there, hands clasped, the photograph of that little Mississippi church between them, viewers around the world understood that they hadn't just watched a debate about faith. They had witnessed faith in action, messy, difficult, beautiful, and ultimately triumphant. But this moment of grace was just the beginning. What happened after the cameras stopped rolling, and how this single conversation rippled out to change countless lives around the world, will leave you speechless. The final chapter of this story proves that sometimes the most powerful victories aren't won through conquest, but through compassion. Stay with us. Hit that like button if this touched your heart, comment hope if you believe in second chances, and make sure you're subscribed because what comes next will restore your faith in the power of human transformation. The moment the cameras stopped rolling, something unprecedented happened. The studio didn't erupt in the usual post-show chatter. Instead, a sacred quiet lingered, as if everyone understood they had just witnessed something that would outlive them all. Crew members wiped tears from their eyes. Audience members sat in stunned silence, reluctant to break the spell that Morgan Freeman's grace had cast over the room. Within minutes, the internet exploded. But this wasn't the usual viral feeding frenzy of outrage and division. This was different. #Morgan Freeman's Grace began trending worldwide, but the comments weren't about taking sides or claiming victory. They were about transformation. "I haven't prayed in 20 years, but I'm praying tonight," wrote one viewer. "This reminded me that faith isn't about being right, it's about being human," shared another. Backstage, Whoopi sat alone in her dressing room, still clutching the faded photograph of Morgan's childhood church. When a producer knocked and asked if she wanted to make a statement, she simply shook her head. Some moments were too sacred for spin, too profound for publicity. Later that evening, she would post a single sentence on social media. "Sometimes the teacher appears when the student is finally ready to learn." Morgan Freeman, meanwhile, declined every interview request that flooded in. He didn't need to explain what had happened. The moment spoke for itself. When asked by his publicist about the viral response, he simply smiled and said, "Grace doesn't need a marketing campaign." But the real impact wasn't measured in views or likes. It was measured in changed hearts. Churches across the country reported record attendance that Sunday, filled with people who hadn't stepped inside in years. Therapy sessions buzzed with conversations about forgiveness and second chances. Parents found themselves having deeper talks with their children about what it really means to believe in something. 3 months later, Whoopi would quietly return to the church of her childhood in Manhattan. She didn't announce it, didn't make it a story. She simply walked through doors she hadn't entered in decades, carrying with her a faded photograph of a little Mississippi church and a new understanding that faith wasn't about having all the answers, it was about having the courage to keep asking the questions. And Morgan Freeman? He continued to live exactly as he always had, with quiet dignity, profound grace, and an unshakable belief that every person, no matter how lost, was worth saving. Because that's what real faith does. It doesn't conquer, it transforms. And in a world obsessed with winning arguments, he had shown millions of people that the greatest victory of all is helping someone else find their way home. This is why Morgan Freeman isn't just an actor. He's a voice of wisdom in a world that desperately needs it. If this story moved you, changed you, or reminded you of what really matters, smash that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe because stories like this, stories that heal instead of hurt, that unite instead of divide, these are the stories our world needs more of. Comment, transformed, if you believe one moment of grace can change everything. Because sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to choose love over victory.